Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of Conversations at Brookings Global. My name is Max Boucher, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Brookings Institution. My colleague and Brookings senior fellow, Tony Pipa, could not join us today, but we are honored to host Henri-Paul Normandin, who is the Director for International Affairs of Montreal. Bonjour, Henri-Paul, and bonjour to Montréal.
Bonjour, Max. Good morning. Very nice to join you this morning.
Henri-Paul, let me start directly. You had a long career in the diplomatic corps of Canada that led you to be Ambassador of Canada of Haiti and Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And now you represent Montreal globally and you present its international affairs. So what led you from being a conventional diplomat to a city diplomat?
Well, thank you, Max. And again, very nice to join this conversation this morning because I think Brookings has been doing some very interesting work with respect to cities and particularly city diplomacy. As a diplomat representing my country, I was involved in bilateral relations. I was posted in Africa, in China for a long time, Haiti, as you mentioned. I also worked in the multilateral world with the United Nations. And in all those years, I addressed a range of issues from sustainable development to human rights. And I was having fun, everything was going right. But then came this opportunity in Montreal. Right off the bat, I have to say that Montreal was my hometown, so that helps. But the other thing as well is that Montreal has always been a very international city. If you go back to the 17th and 18th century, actually, because of our geographic position, Montreal was the point of entry to the entire North American continent. We were the link between Europe and America. So we had a port, then we were a trading center, financial center, and so on. Fast forward to today, Montreal is still very much of an international city because of the diversity of our population to start with. Our economy, aeronautics, artificial intelligence, and so on, very connected to the global economy. Our cultural scene in Montreal, very oriented internationally. And actually, if there are some jazz lovers out there, the Montreal International Jazz Festival is the biggest in the world, and it's the place to be in the summer. I take this as an example. There are many others. And last but not least, we are also a United Nations city. We're host to the International Civil Aviation Organization. We're host to 3 other UN institutions. So put all of this, and for a career diplomat and development worker like me, there was a lot to play with, to start with. And then I had a sense that I could make a contribution with my experience. And here's something interesting to notice. When you represent your country, you represent the total sum of the interests of your country. It matters, it is interesting and rewarding, but at times it can be a little bit abstract. When you work in a city, and particularly for your own city, you have a sense that you're much more part of your community. You get to know the people in the academia, the economic milieu, the cultural milieu, and you can see that what you do matters to them. So this sense of belonging to a community I have really found here in Montreal, and it's been very rewarding for this.
That's great. You already started to describe the different ways a city as global as Montreal is projecting its visibility internationally and the type of tangible benefits that your action and your position is bringing to the city. So before asking you about the specific skill set that you bring to that position, can you describe us a bit, what do you do? What are the type of international affairs that you deal with? And then what are the benefits that residents of Montreal gain from this?
A little bit like a country, we do a range of things. We do some things that are very concrete and the classic things, for instance, international economic promotion. We do that, delegations abroad, trying to attract investment, all that range of things we do. Then we also try to get the share best practices with other cities. How do you do your urban planning? How do you address mobility, and so on. And then we also work, this is not entirely new, but there's been a much stronger emphasis on those issues in the last few years. We work on issues which are both local and global, such as climate change is the most obvious example, because it matters to people. So we do really a range of things. It may even surprise what I would call the classic diplomats. We even work to some extent on issues of peace and security, not defense. We don't have a territory to defend, but radicalization, for instance, extremism, those issues we also address in the kind of work that we do by promoting living together and other issues and social cohesion. So really, it's a range of things. Now, you asked an interesting question: the relationship with the citizens. Two things to say on that. First of all, I strongly believe, like many others do, that what we do internationally has a direct impact in our community. Let me take the most obvious example: climate change. You know, even if in Montreal, we are impacted by climate change, like many other cities, of course, around the world. If we were to reduce our GHG emissions to zero, that would be good in Montreal. But what impact would it have locally? It would be at best marginal, because of course the impact of climate change comes from our collective emissions. So if we want to have an impact on climate change right here in Montreal, we also have to work globally so that the others around the planet also reduce their GHG emissions. To me, this is the most compelling example. There are others, of course, what we do in terms of economic promotion, of course, people can relate to. They see that attracting investment, creating jobs has an impact in the community. But this being said, I will not pretend that it's an easy sell to the community. I would say that only a small proportion of the citizens and a limited constituency of organizations, the academia, the economic players, and so on, the cultural milieu, they really see the importance of international relations. For the vast majority of the population, it's much more challenging. And if there are others out there who have good recipes for how to connect with our citizens, I would be taker. I have to add that, even for countries, foreign policy, it is of high interest to people like you and me and Brookings and others, and probably our listeners. But the vast majority of the population, they don't relate all that much to international relations. And we do face this challenge in Montreal. So I can see the impact that we have, and I always work on that, but it's not an easy sell.
Mm. Yes, it seems indeed that that communication is indeed an issue to clarify and communicate to residents the tangible benefits that they get from this activity. And so, can you describe to what extent your activities and actions are rooted in the priorities of the city? So, Mayor Valérie Plante became mayor in 2017 with a new mandate. Can you describe a bit what was her priorities, including internationally, for the city?
Well, I will highlight two in particular. The attention to the environment is very high on Mayor Plante's agenda, and also the issue of urban mobility as well. So we have been very active locally in terms of trying to reduce our GHG emissions and reducing the impact of climate change. But again, because there's a need to work globally, we have been very active globally as well. She is also very committed to the issue of biodiversity. Biodiversity is not as high on the international agenda as climate change, yet biodiversity is essentially about life on planet Earth. And what we do or don't do in cities and elsewhere has a significant impact. So she's been very involved on those issues and advocating worldwide and acting locally. A more specific example of how this translates in terms of cities getting involved internationally. Last year at the United Nations General Assembly, the Secretary General convened a climate action summit. And of course, at the UN, the main actors are member states, sovereign states. Yet, we wanted to make sure that cities were represented at this table and that they were present. So along with a number of other people and organizations, I did the démarche at the United Nations and with others to make sure that cities would be present. And in the end, it worked. Mayor Plante represented cities from around the world at the UN Climate Action Summit. And she expressed not only how Montreal, but how cities are committed to climate action. So this is a concrete example of how we get involved internationally. And I must say that, and when I walked in the UN again last year, I was used to walking in with my prime minister or ministers, but walking in with my mayor, there was a mix of a sense of déjà vu, those types of meetings, we've seen them, I've seen them, but there was also a sense of something new. Having a mayor speak in such an event was, to me, refreshing. It was a very significant step in terms of the cities being present. We did exactly the same thing in a virtual way this year with biodiversity. So these are examples of how we try to connect the local priorities with the global priorities. Because as I often say, we want to have an impact in our own community, of course, but we also want to be good citizens of the world. So we see our action working on both fronts. And when it comes to mobility here, a lot of cities around the world are trying to develop new ways of developing mobility. And here there are lots of exchanges, and we try to learn and build on the best practices from elsewhere. So these are the kinds of things that, again, make the connection between the local priorities and the global priorities and the global agenda.
And I want to come back later to this connection between the local and the multilateral platforms. But first, let me continue on the city's priorities. So you mentioned 2017, new mandate, a focus on environment, mobility. Then COVID-19 hits. Can you describe a bit to what extent global city cooperation has accelerated or been beneficial in the past 6 months?
Very interesting case, which illustrates a number of points. First of all, when, with COVID, cities, like it or not, we are actors. The measures we take or don't take in terms of sanitation and everything else, we are actors. It starts from there. Secondly, this is such a perfect example of an issue that is so local and so global. So we have to make the connections between the two. So what happened at the beginning was that cities quickly got together in various types of networks, formal and informal. I mean, we had discussions through WhatsApp. Seoul convened a major meeting of mayors on the issue. Some city networks like Metropolis and others set up a platform on health. So we started to connect and exchange information and best practices. And that illustrates the agility that cities have to make connections when there is a need. So this is all positive and useful. Yet, the COVID crisis also illustrates something that did not happen in terms of cities. We are, as cities, over the last few years, we have gained some seats at a number of tables. Climate change, biodiversity, migration, very interesting case in point. But COVID, in terms of global discussions, we were just not there. The meetings of the WHO and so on, that all happened without the cities. We've never been there, and until now, we've never even tried to be there. Yet, again, what cities do or don't do has an impact, locally and globally. So COVID illustrates both the positive, or what has happened so far, and the limitations in terms of city involvement. We've been able to react, share best practices and information, that's all good. But we have been unable to influence the global agenda until now. So I think that's a key thing to mention. This being said, mayors have also got together not only to deal with the current crisis, but to deal with the aftermath. The best example of that, C40, the organization which groups cities mainly on climate change. Well, the C40 cities got together, created a special task force under the leadership of Milan, and of course, Los Angeles is the presidency of the C40. Mayor Plante was on it as well. And the mayors elaborated a set of principles on how to deal with the aftermath of the COVID in our cities. And of course, they called for a green and a just recovery. And they were not alone, but I would like to think that what this task force did, how they advocated their positions nationally and internationally, has had somewhat of an impact on the global discourse on what to do after, not after, but in the time that will follow the COVID. This call for a green and just recovery and what we have to do with it has become part of the common discourse. And I will not pretend that it came only from mayors, no, but I think that the mayors contributed to that.
Mm. And you mentioned sort of strong, very visible networks, city networks like C40 that have been so instrumental and, as you mentioned, so agile to collectively help mayors and cities share knowledge and elevate the collective voice. And I see a question here from the audience that relates to city networks from Till Colby at the UNDP Kenya, who's asking more specifically about the role that city networks can play, like UCLG or Cities Alliance, towards building citizen support for cities to be more involved intentionally. Do you see city networks as helping cities also to demonstrate to citizens their value?
City networks are absolutely critical. You know, if we come back to the notion of diplomacy, if you want to achieve things in terms of diplomacy, you have to work with other stakeholders, to interact with a range of stakeholders. Actually, if I open a little parenthesis here on diplomacy, last year I had to write a little piece on a subject, and I went to dig a definition of diplomacy. And to my surprise, actually, I did not find a commonly agreed definition of diplomacy. So I sort of worked my own using elements of others, and I came up with the following. Diplomacy is essentially the art of pursuing your objectives and your interests, influencing the decisions and behaviors of others through interaction with a range of stakeholders. And that applies both to a country, to a city, to any other level of government. So I like the term city diplomacy because this is exactly what it is. It is diplomacy applied to a city. So to make the link between this and city networks, if we want to achieve things globally as cities, we have to work to interact with a range of stakeholders, but we have also to band together. And our collective voice is so much stronger than our individual voice. And that's why in many instances and more at the UN and in other places, you see city networks of various sorts acting as the means through which cities express their voice. When Mayor Plante spoke at the UN Biodiversity Summit this year, she spoke as a representative of ICLEI on biodiversity. So the city networks are absolutely critical for this, and also for exchanging best practices and so on. In terms of direct relationship with our citizens, I would say that that's more the realm and the work of individual cities. You know, if I bring a declaration of metropolis or UCLG or C40 in Montreal, it resonates only in certain circles. People don't relate too much to those international networks. So it's more how you do it locally. Every city, you have to find a way to connect with your own citizens and explain in your own way how it connects to their agenda. So again, city networks globally, major role, but the interaction with our citizens is really mainly done through ourselves. Compare that with the United Nations. Talk about the United Nations to your citizens, you know, so. So you have to use different language and connect with your local issues.
Yeah. You hinted earlier about impact and to what extent city diplomacy is indeed effectively influencing the global discourse. You mentioned recovery plans and strong pledges that cities have taken, but I want to dig a bit further. To what extent do you see the way cities are currently attempting to influence global agendas and multilateral platforms as the most effective? Are we missing still a connective tissue between the voice of cities, and where today international decisions are being taken and where standards are being drawn, including the United Nations?
It is, the best way to describe it, I think, is it's work in progress. We have achieved a number of things, and there's yet so much more to do. Concrete things that we have achieved without going into too many details. Climate change, we are there, even though we're not a formal party, of course, through the convention, we are definitely influential and our voice is heard. A little bit of the same with biodiversity. Migration, very interesting case in point. When the UN decided to develop the global covenant on regular migration and the global covenant on refugees, when the UN decided to do that 3 years ago, we said, hey, migration, that is of course a global issue, but it's also a local issue. So we got together and literally we pushed our way in and we managed to go and get a seat at the global table. Interesting. A number of international organizations and countries as well welcomed that. They were glad to see us there because they realized that what we do or don't do at the local level is significant. So we've made some progress on some fronts. On other fronts, and also the migration, we also came up with some suggestions in terms of language with the compacts. So I don't want to overstate the case, but this is a case where we walked in and we had some influence and we locked ourselves in the follow-up mechanisms, which is significant. But again, there are other issues where we're not there or not there yet. COVID, I think, is the same, is a case in point. And you know, sometimes people ask me, what is the difference between national diplomacy and city diplomacy? My answer is there's a whole lot in common in terms of what we have to do, pursuing objectives, how you do it, networks, connections, advocate your positions, and so on. A lot in common. But there are two fundamental differences. One is city diplomacy is, if I can put it this way, and that may shock some people, optional for a city. A lot of cities just don't do city diplomacy. They just focus on, you know, their local issues and that's it. I would say that they miss an instrument for their own development. But anyway, but city diplomacy is optional. Some cities do it, some cities don't. The other major difference is that if you're a country, by definition, you have a seat at the table. You walk in an international conference and there's a plaque there that says Canada or the United States or whatever, your seat is there. If you're a city or a city network, you have to fight for your seat. Sometimes with success, sometimes not. So I think that that is the significant difference between city diplomacy and national diplomacy. So we've been successful in a number of instances, and we have not been successful in others. And the key to success, of course, you have to advocate for yourself, you have to have relevant positions, you have to show your relevance. And here, a key point I would like to make in terms of influence is that cities are not only influencers, we are actors. And because we are actors on so many of these issues, we gain some legitimacy and that enables us to influence. Let me take a great example of the connection between the global agenda and the local agenda. The Sustainable Development Goals, a world agenda enacted by the United Nations, of course, primarily adopted by states, but cities were there to some extent when this was developed. And the United Nations and many member states realize that if, as an international community, we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, where you need the involvement of many stakeholders, civil society, of course, you also need other levels of government, including cities. So that is why more and more international organizations begin to make space because they see their own interest in the involvement of cities. And of course, as cities, we see how we can make a contribution and we see how it is of interest to us as well. And cities, a number of cities, growing number of cities have gone as far now as submitting what we call voluntary national reviews on how they implement the SDGs locally. And I know that you at Brookings, you're involved in that movement, and I think that is very significant. So we've achieved a lot, especially in the last 10 years, I would say. But again, a long way to go. And again, work in progress.
It has been fascinating indeed to see cities embrace this international agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, as a tool to report, track transparently their progress on the goals. It's been very interesting. And I see another question from the audience. COVID-19 has pushed us back to our houses to work. For a diplomat and for a city diplomat, how do you engage effectively virtually in time of COVID?
Fascinating, actually, because when all this started, we were puzzled like everybody else. But you know what? It has been, in terms of conducting diplomacy, it has been pretty much the same for cities than for countries in terms of how we have adapted. Of course, no more travel. In terms of my personal life, that's a plus, I must say, and for many people too. But we've replaced the travel by video conferences. My general proposition is the following, is that by and large, we have been able to pursue diplomatic work through video conferences, by and large, okay? It's the same for us as it is for national governments. There have even been a few advantages. You know, if you wanted to have your mayor, your prime minister, or your minister participate in an international conferences, you know, you had to ask him to commit 2, 3, 4 days to travel, to be there and all of that, with all the time and money and all that. Nowadays, you want to convince him or her to take part in an international conference for 2 hours, you just plug in. And I've seen some international conferences where you have greater attendance of the senior leaders because it's so much easier. That's been the plus. Yeah. But on the negative side, 2 things. First of all, you know how networking is important in diplomacy. And I feel that I have not expanded my network in the last 6 months. I still deal essentially with the same people as I used to. And I think it's the same for most diplomats. That, in the long run, is not positive. Secondly, the very hard negotiations when you have to conduct them. I'll take the example of biodiversity. You know, COP has been postponed. So Montreal as a city and many other countries and Italy, we continue to advocate and make some progress in terms of advocacy on the development of a global biodiversity framework for the following 10 years. But the hard negotiations cannot take place by video conference. So the COP has been postponed, and it may be postponed yet again because we have to prepare in the lead up to this conference. So when it comes to hard negotiations, and I would say for countries, it's a bit of the same with respect to peace and security. The hard issues sometimes are going to be hard to crack if you're not meeting in person somewhere. I find it fascinating, by the way, that the General Assembly of the United Nations this year took place virtually. Who would have thought that just a few months ago? But here we are. It came with the positive, but also it came with the negative, because some of the hard issues, I think, were not addressed because people were not meeting together.
Yeah. Henri-Paul, you mentioned the skill of networking, and as a diplomat, you brought to your position a wealth of experience. It reminds me also as Ambassador Nina Ashigian, who is heading the international affairs of the city of Los Angeles. Not all cities can bring, again, such expertise to that position. So to end, I would like to ask you, what are the type of skill sets that your position require, and also advices that you might have for smaller cities or less engaged globally that want to also engage, like Montreal, on global affairs?
Well, in terms of skill sets that are needed to conduct international relations in a city or in a country, it's knowledge of the issues, it's the know-how, including the cultural know-how and the protocol and everything. It's the knowledge of the institutions and the ways of doing business, and it's the network. And like in many other fields, you also have to be creative, innovative, and persistent, and be able to develop some networks. So this is the skill set that is, I think, necessary to be effective, whether for a city or for a national diplomat. This being said, as you pointed out, there are a few people like me, like Nina in Los Angeles. I think Houston is in the same situation, Seoul, Paris. a few cities have career diplomats or former career diplomats working with them. But, so we come with a certain experience, but I would not argue at all that it is necessary to have to be a career diplomat to do your work effectively. Many of my peers in many cities don't have this experience as a career diplomat, yet they're doing extremely well in their job and they're representing their city extremely well. So it's a mix of skills that you have to bring, and then as in any other field in terms of leadership, what you don't have in terms of knowledge and skills and etc., well, you build a team and you go and get it elsewhere.
That's the closing word. Thank you, Henri-Paul. It's been wonderful to speak with a fellow Francophone, in English. So thank you for your time. We very much appreciate it. Everyone, thank you for joining. This was another edition of our conversations at Brookings Global that we are holding regularly on cities around sustainable development and international affairs. We will see you next time. Thank you for joining and stay safe. Goodbye.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Au revoir.